Welcome everybody, and a big welcome to our two speakers tonight. We've got Dyer and Ranty Highwayman Mark. Is he here? I haven't spotted him. He should be here. And we've got, I really wanted, because I've just kind of finished a PhD thinking and writing about the development of the city that I live in, Newcastle, since the 1960s. And a big part of that was one neighbourhood biker. And Dyer is going to talk to us about a visionary plan for how we might kind of mend that neighbourhood, which has got sort of, has been developed to have quite, extensive road building. So I'm really looking forward to that. And we also have Ranty Highwayman is going to talk about filtered permeability tonight. But before we get on to our talks, we've got our usual news roundup. So if you have anything that you'd like to share about something that's been happening in your neighbourhood or in your city, or if you want to raise something that's been happening nationally for discussion, this is your chance. So has anybody got any news to share for us? Oh, one hand up, David.
Yeah, just two pretty good things happened in Birmingham last week. Firstly, we had the book launch of Daniel Knowles's book Carmageddon, which I'd highly recommend. I'm halfway, well, 3/4 of the way through it. It's a long book. It really captures everything in the title, and it's very international in its perspective, as it would be coming from a journalist who works for The Economist. But there's nothing new in it in a way, but it's just so interesting to get it all pulled together. And it was a nice discussion in Moseley. And a couple of days after, we had the Active Travel Academy from Westminster University up in Birmingham for a showcase. Some of their students and staff have done presentations here, but if you get an opportunity to get one of their showcases in your city, I assume they're probably funded by the research councils to do it once a year to show impact. I don't know. I'd highly recommend it anyway. It's just really great to talk to a whole bunch of enthusiastic PhD students on a whole range of interests concerned with active travel. And it was mainly done through posters and a workshop and a marketplace format. And a lot of people came, and it was generally a very good day. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. And Simon.
Hi, yeah, we've got, I think, two bits of news. One is we have a new CEO starting in September. The announcement is all over Twitter and LinkedIn and what have you. So woot for that. And you can go and read all about that. But I think probably the bigger news is the Cycling Action Plan 2 launched last week at Herne Hill Velodrome. So we have a new set of maps, a new set of kind of approaches for London. And I think the interesting and good thing is basically the TfL is now saying that central London and commuter cycling is kind of is not the growth area, as it were, because we're already getting pretty good at doing all that stuff. And actually the growth area is out of London now, and lots more cycling to shops and schools and tube stations and things like that, rather than these big radial commuter routes, and cycling being much more diverse. So that was a kind of a good thing. There is a very low risk, tiny version of the strategic cycling analysis in the new Cycling Action Plan, which is like the map of all of the routes that TfL are going to prioritise. That's due a bigger version of that coming September, and a whole refresh of that. But yeah, basically lots of outer London gains is the big one, and a big focus coming from London on LTNs apparently in the year. So controversial for everyone else, but increasingly we're going to see London just getting on and doing that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's awesome.
Great, that's great to hear. Thanks, Simon. Carolyn.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to let you guys know about a couple of forthcoming events. So one is Cycle Sisters on the 11th of July has got a diversity in cycling online event, 12:30 to 2:30, and that's to launch the publication of 3 new guides about increasing diversity in cycling. So one is for community cycling groups that want to become more diverse. One is for local authorities and what they can do to support. And the other one is for people that want to, set up their own, get their own groups off the ground. And we've got a good range of speakers for that. And then at Possible, with the Car Free Cities campaign, on the 18th of July. We've got an event which is going to be in person in London and also online as a hybrid event. It's called Riders on the Storm, and it's primarily for councillors and council officers. It's all about urban traffic reduction, and we're going to be looking at things like car wars, and hearing from various people who've fought the good fight, and it'll be coinciding with our new report and the last of our reports with the Active Travel Academy, which is looking at low traffic neighbourhoods and voting behaviour. And yes, I'll pop the details for both of those in the chat. For Riders on the Storm, we've just got a save the date link, and then the booking link will be coming out sometime next week.
Brilliant, thank you. I was just going to ask you, that's brilliant, thanks. Jamie.
Thank you, and hello everyone. Really great to hear positive news. I'm afraid I've come to bring some rather bad news from Brighton and Hove. The new Labour administration have just scrapped all of our active travel schemes that were in line and funded from Active Travel England. That's the A259, the A23, which is the London Road. And yesterday they decided to scrap the Valley Gardens wonderful urban regeneration project, which links the sea with a bike lane up to the Central Valley Gardens project. So it's devastating news here in Brighton and Hove. If anyone here would like to get involved in helping us with that through Twitter, through emails, please do get in touch with me. I'll put my details in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie, and I'm sorry about that. That's but thank you for sharing. Bob.
Hi, yeah, just a quickie. I don't know if you mentioned about Active Travel Cafe next week at Cycle County, Active County at Oxford. Apart from the Active Travel Cafe, I shall be speaking on Wednesday at 1:30 on how can we avoid a culture war. So hope to see you there.
Great. Yeah, there's quite a few. We have quite a few regulars who are making an appearance, so it should be good. And we're hoping. I think that what the aim of what we're going to do is sort of do a roundup so that people who can't be there kind of get a sense of what's being discussed. Do we have anyone else with any more news to share? No. Great. Right. In that case, we will move on to our first speaker. So as I've already mentioned, I am delighted to have Daniel Dyer here, who's going to talk about Biker, and I'm going to let him introduce himself properly.
Well, thanks for having me. Can you hear me?
Yeah, great.
Great. Well, I'll share my screen and we'll get going. Can you see that? Does that come up?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. So my name's Daniel Dyer. I work at Mawson Kerr Architects, but this work was sort of loosely done with work, but the way it came about was so I live in the East End of Newcastle. I used to live in the Biker Wall development, then I moved to another part just nearby, which is actually to the other side of Shields Road, which is an important road in this scheme, which is for those of you not from the northeast, Shields Road is basically the road next to Hadrian's Wall. So it's an ancient road, and it takes on it's in the east end of Newcastle. It's kind of the historic central shopping street, and it was once a really grand, important shopping street that's kind of down on its luck a bit due to some of the changes that we'll go through. So this project came about. It's one of those things when you live in an area and you're an architect, you obviously have ideas about it and how you'd like things changed, but you don't normally draw them. But in this case, I got in touch with Neil from town, who's on here as well, who lives nearby, and he's also a kind of a critic of some of the changes that happened in this area in the past that caused the issues, and we spoke about it in the pub, and then we thought let's kind of put some pen to paper, put this idea out there and see what people think of it, without any pretext to getting jobs out of it and that sort of thing. It was just an idea kind of to get people thinking. So I'll run you through it. So here we go. So this is the area. You can see Shields Road marked on there. And then the other kind of important road is Heaton Road that runs up to Heaton. So south of Shields Road, you have Biker, which you'll recognise the Biker Wall and the estate. And then north of Shields Road, you have Heaton, which is kind of a traditional, quite wide streeted terraced street. It's not your traditional like Victorian workers housing. It's slightly larger than that, quite generous housing in Heaton. And traditionally below Shields Road was kind of your denser terraces and kind of some Victorian slum terraces, which was what was cleared before this was built. And this is where the area is. It kind of sits to the east of the city centre, north of the River Tyne. You can see there Byker, Heaton, you know, a really important spot in the city. It's worth saying there's a metro system in Newcastle that's links to Sunderland. It's the second biggest metro system outside of London in the UK. And yeah, it's a really good facility. So it stops just off Shields Road. And then you've got the two areas to the north and south. So yeah, this is the historic plan that existed before. And as you can see, it's kind of your dense Victorian grid pattern centered around Shields Road. And at this time, this was kind of a thriving, animated high street. And this is what it would have looked like. So Shields Road had the terraces spilling out onto, the terraces were spilling out onto Shields Road rather than what it is now. So I'll flick back and then I'll go forward again. So this view, this is the old department store on the high street. And then you can see how it's changed. So the old connections through to Byker are gone, and you're left with these dead ends, as it were. And then what they went on to do was put a bypass through, which isn't very heavily used. You can see there's another road to the left of it. There's kind of three roads that make this north-south route, and all the old connections were broken. And obviously this is a far less inviting, safe, pleasant way to get from where you live to your high street. And this kind of shows it. So where once you had those dense terrace streets, you've now got in red this bypass. And then you've got all these car parking spaces. And the other thing that's happened that you'll notice is that the spaces that aren't car parks have been changed in size and scale. So rather than be kind of small terrace house style units that build up to create your urban grain, they're large institutional buildings. So there's a police station, there's a swimming pool, and obviously this means there's less overlooking, less eyes on the street, all these things. So it's not a great place to be. So this is the sort of environment that you have. So this is the police station just off Shields Road. So the irony being Shields Road has a lot of antisocial behaviour and issues with crime, despite the fact that that's where the police station is. It doesn't sort those issues out by having the police there. These problems are caused partly by the urban planning of the area. There's a Freemason temple there. There's a large swimming pool. So it's these, big uses. And then there's a metro, again, with very little around it. There's very little housing, very little facing onto these public spaces. And then this is a private car park that's occupied on the site. So this is run by Wynn solicitors, who are sort of a solicitor call center on the site. And they've, privatized a chunk of this land right next to the high street, which actually that car park is next to this public square, which is generally empty and has nothing feeding onto it, no shops opening onto it. And then, more of the same. So large buildings, very few doors, windows, and closed routes. So we looked at this area about 5 years ago for a competition, and we had this idea, perhaps rather than these big uses, we should be putting people back and different uses. So maybe a high street can't sustain the number of shops it used to sustain. So perhaps we could put a school on the high street, or a mosque, or a church, or any number of uses, or a manufacturing. There could be all sorts of things on there rather than just traditional retail that's struggling, and then it would be supported by the people that live behind it. And then so now I'm taking you to Heaton, which is the area to the north, and if you were thinking of a way to like solve this area, which is struggling because of the way it's been planned. Perhaps we could replicate a little bit of Heaton, which is a great Victorian plan, which supports lots of independent shops. Lots of people live there. It's one of the densest parts of Newcastle. It's got one of the highest employments in Newcastle. Lots of young people live in there. And there's this great Catholic church on the high street. And the way all of this is supported in that area isn't just because there's great stuff there. It's because it's supported by all these people, the density, as I mentioned. So these houses are what supports all those uses. You can't have a Catholic church without Catholics. So that's how it works. But it's not perfect, and something I would say we can be idealistic about the Victorian housing that used to exist in some parts of our country, like in Byker, that was cleared. And I think this picture of a back street of Heaton gives you an idea of some of the issues. Is that some of it is quite hard surfaced. There's not much green space, and these back lanes aren't particularly great either. They're just there to collect bins. They don't really have any other use, and the people that live in these houses don't have particularly good access to outdoor space. So yeah, I then wanted to think about, well, what could we do in Byker? Is it more like Heaton, or what's the kind of the modern answer? What's the right answer? So I got the book, which is about Jan Gehl architects in Copenhagen, and I started reading about how to make great public spaces and incorporating active travel and green spaces into our public space. And you'll notice that one of the first paragraphs in the foreword, David Sim, who wrote this book, starts to outline, where to look for sort of the right architects who have shown examples of this housing. And he starts straight away with Ralph Erskine, who of course built the Byker Wall. So we're back to Byker with a way to build spaces which allow people to travel comfortably on foot and live in dense locations with access to green space and with lots of shade and trees and their own bench and all of these things that Erskine brought in. And I remember my time living in Byker, and my children would play out and take their bikes out, and my daughter learned to ride the bike when I think she was 3, which was, I didn't learn till I was 5. It was, it's really young to learn because all the children were out playing and learning that sort of thing. And I spent time in Byker, when I lived there, because it was, right through lockdown, painting the colours and the benches and all those things, and looking at the man over my road sitting out in front of his house. And I thought, something of this is what we need in our urban planning. And this is where I moved to nearby, where again, the 70s planning, they incorporated green space so children could play out and have safe places into their urban square, which was partly what attracted us to move there once we had to leave Byker because we needed a bigger house, as it were. So this is the plan I came up with that sort of it reconnects Heaton to Byker. It puts Heaton Road back in. It puts back a grid pattern, as it were, and it allows people to live at a density and near amenities. One thing I found living in this area is we don't need to use our car very much, not because we work hard to not use it particularly, just because my children live within walking distance to school. I live within cycling distance of work. So it's very easy to get by. We can take our car if we've got a long travel to see family or whatever, but we don't need to use it very much. So this type of dense urbanism is a way of making it easy for people to choose not to use their car just because it's easier. And it also means that if we can build houses in these areas at the heart of our city, we take pressure off the council having to work out what to do with these big lumps of land, because we're giving them to individuals who buy these lands and develop this land, just like it works in Heaton. They can start businesses, and we can have a great diversity of employment and housing and all sorts of things in that area. And also it means we're not having to build out on the edge of our city as much, because we're taking pressure off and we're absorbing that in the centre of the city. So yeah, this is what it might look like. I imagined a sort of dense Scandinavian urbanism that picks up in density around the metro, which we really want to support so that it's viable into the future. And this is the view along Heaton Road, which is, Heaton is a wealthier area than Byker, and I like the kind of the symbolism of pushing it through to connect the two areas, so you don't have this great divide caused by the bypass. This is maybe an idea of, it was just a sketch I did. It's kind of it's a Heaton terrace, but it's taken on the colours and some of the priorities of Erskine. I say that was the great thing about Erskine as an architect, is his priorities came through in his architecture. So he made sure you got a south-facing bench or a tree or somewhere to grow things, and he prioritized that across all the residents, so that the little things defined his architecture rather than the grand moves of ego, as it were. It's more about the priority of the small things, like giving someone a bench for once. And then this is just I wanted to do a drawing that showed where Byker is in relation to the city, and you imagine there's maybe a tower on the metro, so that you're increasing the density where you need it, and that metro takes you straight into town, takes you to the stadium, takes you to the new science district being developed, takes you to the city centre, takes you to the airport, and then the housing can incorporate green spaces at the centre for children playing, for bikes, for all that sort of thing that you need in an urban area, and we can welcome more people to the centre of the city, as it were. Yeah, and that's the idea, as it were.
Thanks, Daniel. That's fantastic.
No
And I
problem.
think, yeah, I think one of the reasons that I thought this was a presentation that was really worth sharing is that when we talk a lot about, we've talked about planning, we've talked about landscape design, but really, I think, we have a lot of cities that look like this, that have, had such massive changes to them that aren't just about how you move around, but it is also land use, and it is, the massive severance that's caused by some of these roads. And I think actually it's interesting because Simon talking about Outer London before, which is, I don't know, potentially there are more similarities, I think, that to this kind of 70s, 60s, 70s redevelopment than there would be in inner London, and that's the sort of huge kind of problem that you're tackling, and these massive car parks and huge supermarkets and these roads which are sort of and that's the challenge, I think. I mean, I guess my question, I'll ask you a difficult question: what do you do with that big road?
Well, I mean, in this plan, I've just got rid of it because it's not needed. Whether the council would find it difficult to do that, or I don't know if it's a fundamental priority to delete the road. In my mind, I think the fundamental priority is that you make the space available for people to live there again. So that could be done either by removing the bypass or by changing the nature of it, or burying it, so that it doesn't affect the land like it does now, because people don't want to live next to motorway infrastructure, and I think that's one of the main problems with it through the heart of the city. Well, the other thing obviously is that people, when they're using motorway infrastructure, are driving in that sort of mindset. I've been knocked off my bike once in the city, and it was on one of these roundabouts where someone's coming off a central motorway road. They're in motorway mindset, they're looking for gaps, they're trying to hit gaps, and they've been coming at speed, and suddenly they're in a place where there's bikes around them, and they don't react in the right way because it's just a change. So I got knocked off on one of those, and that's the sort of, it's dangerous to have them in the city for that reason, because I think they put motorists in the wrong mindset for dealing with everyday cyclists and pedestrians. So changing the nature of it or removing it is what I'd like to do with it. I mean, this dealing with this sort of land is obviously really challenging, and everyone says we want to deal with brownfield land first. That's a universally accepted view, but it needs it just needs a bit more robustness, I think, if it's to be done properly from councils and central government. Really, it needs to come from the top rather than just blaming it on councils, because we used to be able to be robust in the opposite way. So obviously the city bought up loads of people's houses and shops and things and then cleared them to put this stuff through. So it might be that you need similar robustness in order to deal with it the other way, I would say.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Do you want to stop sharing, Daniel, and then we can? Yeah. I'm going to bring people in for questions. Yeah, I mean, I think that that was created by comprehensive redevelopment policies and that and that took a lot of land into public ownership, which has gone back into private ownership, into different hands. So yeah, it's a big task. Tim, you got your hand up. You've got a question.
Yeah, thank you. That was a really great presentation, Daniel. Thank you. And beautiful to look at as much as anything. I first went to Byker on a study trip in 1976 because I was doing geography at Durham, and they hadn't quite completed it, I think, at that point. But my memory has always been that the wall was built because the urban motorway was being built and they needed to protect the old Byker, which they were redeveloping in Erskine's model. So that huge, and then they didn't build the motorway, was my understanding. So clearly the bypasses are sort of downgraded.
Yes, it was smaller than the original one planned. Yeah, but it did go in a kind of reduced state. Yeah.
And the other thought would be that Utrecht seems to be putting canals back instead of motorways. So there's some good examples, and that your last picture reminded me of those images. Thank you very much for that.
Thanks, Tim. Did I see another hand up? Oh,
Neil had his hand up, but it's gone.
It's gone. Does anybody else have any?
There's some on the WhatsApp, Sally.
Is that, sorry, my bad. Somebody has asked, where are planning teams in their thinking about creating space like this? I think they want to do these things, but what's stopping them? From Rachel Wigginton.
I guess it's a big question. I mean, the initial plan and clearing this land was done at a time when they believed there was going to be continued economic prosperity in the east end of the city, sort of in the 60s. So the massively changing economic situation obviously made it way more difficult for them a long time ago. And I think in many ways, the council have been trying to pick up the pieces from that. And if you follow the local plans through the 80s, the 90s, there's like a growing concern for industry, and then just the real economic crisis in the area and the loss of jobs, unemployment, all that. So there's been a lot to deal with in the area. It's not as simple as just saying planners got everything wrong. It's it has been a really challenging time for the east end of the city since, because obviously the original ideas that created this were in the 60s in a totally different time. So yeah, I think planners and sort of city transport people would probably be in favour if they could click a button and have this sort of environment. But so I've got an alarm going off, but it's not as simple as that. It's just being able to put it back.
Yeah, thanks. And another question in the chat: have you shared this with the council? Are you linked into the Place Innovation Programme that's running at the moment in Byker? And that's from Mike Cookson.
Sorry, can you give me a sec? Just got an alarm going off. I'll take someone else's question.
I'm just checking how many more questions we've got. I think we'll move. Should we move on to Mark, and we can pick up those questions for Daniel again if he gets back. Mark, are you here?
Yes, just about. I've just had a major computer failure, so I'm in a
Oh,
different
no,
place,
Oh.
different background. So there we go.
Hang on a second.
Oh, Daniel's back.
Have
Do
we
you
got him back?
I'm
Let's
back,
just check.
sorry, yeah.
Is that all right?
Yeah, it's just alarms
Okay.
going off.
Okay, so right, we've got a couple more questions, and then
Yeah.
we're going to move on to Mark. Yeah, so Mike Cookson asked, have you shared it with the council, and are you linked with the Place Innovation Programme?
Yes, we are connected. We've shared it with the council, and yeah, there's a lot to sort out, as I've tried to cover, but yeah, we're involved in the project going forward. So there's not a lot being released about it publicly yet, so I wouldn't want to say too much, but yeah, we talked to them about this plan prior to them kind of creating their wider project, so they've got it in mind, and obviously they've got to deal with there's obviously lots of stakeholders that own land and large employers in the area who are really important in the local community. So there's work going on to talk to everyone, as it were. But the council themselves can't just click their fingers and do this. So it's not all on there, all on them, as it were, to kind of make something like this happen, I'd say.
Yeah, thanks. And then there's just a final comment. Edward Lamb says, take a look at plans for Dock Branch Park in Birkenhead. Could be some inspiration for what to do with the bypass. And he's put a link in the chat there.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I'll have a look.
Great. Well, thank you very much again. And we look forward to having you back here in a few years' time and hearing good things have happened.
When I've retired, probably.
Right, moving on to Mark. Are you there?
I am, yes. Yeah, different view this week because I'm on a different computer. So let's share a screen. There we go. You should be seeing that now.
Yeah, great.
Filtered permeability this week, and this is one of my most favourite photos I've ever taken of infrastructure, because it somehow came out quite good. It doesn't look like this now. It's full of graffiti, unfortunately, but yeah, very London centric this week, I'm afraid, because that's where I've got most of my filter photos from. I hope Simon's Walden Forest Claxon is ready to go, because there's a few of those here as well. So let's try and run round the subject of filtered permeability. So as you remember, last time I was here, I was talking about status quo, level playing fields, all that kind of thing. So generally speaking, again, you can drive where you like, as well as park where you like, as I discussed last time. But we have some rules that sort of shape that. So we drive on the left, ride on the left. With a big book of traffic signs that have meanings, with national speed limits, with standard arrangements of things. So we have footways for pedestrians, cycle tracks for people cycling and walking. And it's more complicated for mobility scooters. But generally speaking, if you have a road there, a carriageway, you can drive like whatever you fancy doing within the general rules. What we can do is, like with the parking, oops, let's get the right one here. Yeah, with the parking, we can modify all of that with a traffic order, and filter permeability is one method of managing traffic with traffic orders, amongst other things. So local authorities have powers under the Road Traffic Regulation Act to regulate the movement of traffic, and that could be any traffic at all. That could include pedestrians, cyclists, drivers, different size of vehicles, different class of vehicles, all that kind of thing. There's also some planning powers, as I found out very recently, which just shows that somebody who's been around a bit can learn new things, but it seems to be a much rarer use of the powers. I'm going to concentrate on the highway powers tonight. Dr. Steve Mellier of the University of West of England has got a really good definition of filter permeability here, which he coined. I'm not going to read the whole thing out here. You can read that yourself as I pause for a second. But his take on this is more about filtering to enable sustainable modes, so walking, cycling, buses, and that kind of thing. And as you'll discover in a minute, there's loads and loads of ways of filtering, including Ballina Road, as I said at the beginning, which not only has physical barriers to stop people driving through. For a certain section to get through, as you would have noticed, there's a height restriction, which I'll come to shortly. So what is filtered permeability in terms of definitions? Low traffic neighbourhoods are all the rage. Some people are saying they're tainted. Doesn't really matter. Some people call them active neighbourhoods. We've got livable neighbourhoods, quieter neighbourhoods I've seen. School streets are a kind of filtered permeability. But probably the original modern term is an environmental area, which came from the Buchanan Traffic in Towns report. Yes, lots of terms, lots of fashions, lots of controversies, but basically it's good old-fashioned traffic management. As I say, traffic in the widest possible sense, but we are really talking about motor traffic tonight. And like a lot of other things, we can use our experimental traffic order process to deal with filtered permeability, try it on for size. So going into a bit more detail, we use modal filters to achieve our aims here. So we can do it in a single location. We can do it all over an area. But what we're trying to do is push this longer distance motor traffic away from the side streets. And that could include shopping streets and town centres. With things like point closures, no entries, one-way systems, bus gates, bus roads, pedestrian and cycle zones, weight limits, which can be environmental or structural. And we have width, length and height limits. There's probably others that I've missed there, but that's kind of the main roundup. Now, this is not an exact table. It's kind of my interpretation of just trying to get a feel of the different types of treatment that I've split into heavy, medium and light. Heavy being things that are pretty much impossible to vandalize or for people to get through if they shouldn't be there. Medium, kind of the same thing, but it is possible for those that shouldn't be going through to get access. And also legitimate people can get through there with access, which we'll pick up in a minute. And the light touch stuff really is limits, so it's sign only restrictions, things that are just enforced by cameras, long traffic routes through an area, so you're trying to make it less attractive to drive through an entire area than go on the main roads, which sometimes can work, bus gates and some of these limits. So not an exact science, some jump between the categories here, but it's just kind of a way of thinking about it. Don't worry, there are plenty of photos in just a second. So let's look at heavy, medium and light, and the first klaxon for Waltham Forest. So with a heavy filter, and that's something that's not intended for anybody to drive through there, including emergency vehicles, it's really effective because nobody can get through there. It's there for walking and cycling. Great opportunities for public realm, which really cements the feeling of safety, the feeling of resident ownership. It's a place rather than just a piece of road there. And crucially for me, and this is why I would always say a heavy type filter should be the first choice if you're designing a scheme, it's this big feeling of safety. So children can play there quite happily. People can stand there, have a chat in the street. That's what that it's a residential street. That's what it's for. Or even walk along the carriageway because they know there's going to be very little motor traffic through there. So that's the heavy filter's advantages. Disadvantages, they can be expensive. They can be an issue for emergency access, and potentially they take lots of political capital. I've picked Old Bethnal Green Road in Tower Hamlets on purpose here because it's a really expensive scheme, lots of political capital invested in building it. We've also got the current mayor of Tower Hamlets trying to take it away. He's gone very quiet on it now. You could argue this is a bit more of a medium filter because there are removable bollards for emergency vehicles. But I guess the point here, between these four walls, between friends here, if we can get stuff like this built, it makes it a lot harder for them to be ripped out, frankly. That's another good advantage of a heavy filter. So medium filters, they're effective. Obviously, they're lower cost, much easier to experiment with than doing a big streetscape scheme. There's some more network resilience, and by that I mean, if you have a filter like the one that you have on the screen here, if there's some roadworks on the road beyond, if you had to, you could take the bollard out and just use it as a temporary diversion with a temporary traffic order. So that gives you a bit of that resilience there. Again, gives you that feeling of safety. And I've said fire brigade access rather than emergency access because generally speaking, it's the fire brigade that wants to go through one of these closures. Ambulance crews don't necessarily carry keys. The police probably don't because they're probably coming from lots of different areas. In general terms, the fire brigade will have a patch they know really well. To the point, at least in my experience in London, if you gave them bespoke keys for a particular patch, as long as everybody who could be called into that patch has got them, they're pretty pragmatic about it. The one exception is the centre bollard there that you can actually drive a fire engine over, which the fire brigade know and some local builders know, and they'll take a chance. But maybe every month we should replace them with a solid bollard just to stop the builders going through. But there you go. That's a medium filter. It's fairly good, but it's got some disadvantages. Those disadvantages are again, there's a fair amount of cost involved potentially. It doesn't cater for full emergency access beyond fire, so there could be other non-blue light emergencies going on. Unauthorized use is this big problem. You can buy a key to a fire brigade padlock absolutely anywhere, often left off, often a nightmare to go back and have to keep replace. The other thing is, if it's a fairly light one, as we've got here in Brent, that would be very easy and attractive for a future politician to decide they're going to remove, subject to following the traffic order processes. So you've less cemented the design in the street scene for the future. So width restriction, that's another kind of medium thing. Particular example on the left here, great because it completely stops rat running by HGVs who should be on the trunk road, but it still allows people with smaller vehicles to carry on their rat running and not have to change their behaviour. So it's done a good job locally, but it's not perfection in my view. But that's a positive. You know, it's something. We've dealt with the HGV issue itself. This particular one, you can't unlock anything, so you've got the emergency access from a fire brigade point of view, could be a disadvantage. And from the feeling safe point of view of kids playing football on the street beyond, no real protection from this because people can still drive through in smaller cars. Junction plug, which is another interesting one. So this particular scheme here, the road beyond the plug, as it's called, is two-way. So it's nice and flexible for the residents that live within there for their access. Emergency vehicles of all classes could drive the wrong way through that no entry with care. That's quite useful from an emergency point of view. These days, we'd probably want to start camera enforcing it, it comes with a disadvantage there, I guess. Can create some complex movements. So this one relies on anybody leaving the estate to have to turn left, and that's to try and break a rat run through this particular estate to avoid traffic signals. Horses for courses, really. And then we have the light filters, which are cheap, flexible, very easy to experiment with, very good for emergency access of all kinds. Crucially, in some situations, really useful for blue badge access. And you can have other people on a permit, which I'll come to in a second. Nice example from Stoke Newington, Church Street in Hackney, which is talked about as a bus gate, but it isn't actually a bus gate. It's a no motor vehicles gate with an exemption for permit holders and buses. It's a slightly different piece of use of traffic orders, but a bit of paint, a couple of signs, that's very, very cheap. We've also got some disadvantages. So again, we're back with the future politics. So I've mentioned Tower Hamlets before. I think they've taken a bus gate out there under the new mayor already. Can be unintuitive. So I'd argue the disadvantage about this layout is you're kind of relying on people actually reading signs. And if signs worked, we'd have no speeding. So there are people that miss signs. That's a fact of life. So it isn't really designed to discourage people driving. So we could probably do better there. Probably like this is a bit better at Enfield. It looks a bit more, you shouldn't be driving there. It does rely on camera enforcement, and not everybody has the powers yet across England and Wales. If you start to have lots of exemptions, you have a very, very big list of exemptions, which are a complete nightmare to manage, especially if you have, say, Royal Mail. You can write them into the traffic order until the postie gets a replacement van because theirs is being repaired and it's a hire van and it's not on the list. They get a ticket, Royal Mail have to get informed by the hire company and it goes through, and it's a big rigmarole that really wastes everybody's time. The feeling of safety by now is probably pretty much gone. And then, yeah, unauthorised use, cover number plates, people drive through. There's lots of that going on. So I would say that's the big disadvantage. The big advantage with this particular one in Enfield was everything else is really well filtered. They really needed an additional emergency access, I think refuse access, just because of the local road network. So I'll never discount them if there's a very good reason, but this is kind of my last resort of filtering. We've also got bus gates, which again, great for buses, great for emergency services and anything else. So this particular one here in Havering does have an exemption for refuse collection in the order. So the signs does say authorised vehicles, so that's quite useful. But again, we've got this enforcement, feeling of safety, unauthorised user issue that we had on other ones. That one was fine because the developer paid the bill to put the infrastructure in the first place. Experiments are great because we can play around with layouts. If they don't work quite rightly, we can shift things around and adjust them. Disadvantages of experiments is they can take quite a lot of political capital. And if politicians lose their nerve, they're very easy to remove. And if you've got something controversial, it takes in hours and hours and hours of staffing to have to manage complaints and respond to freedom of information requests and anything else that people stir up. So unfortunately, this really good one in Redbridge, at Wanstead Park Road, which is part of Quiet Way 6, as it was, it's changed name now, that was removed. They got too nervous there and they removed it. Big shame. 2 really nice LTNs there, which are doing a great job. We also can have some short links. Again, you give active travel an advantage here over general traffic. Emergency routes are good. You can do them as part of new development, as this particular one here was put in. Get great feeling of safety. You can go behind these bollards here and just stand around and chat. But you have to get the opportunity. They're not available everywhere. You have to have the land to do it. Maybe a fear of crime going through a link that's not too overlooked. This one's not too bad. It's fairly short. And just a little legacy I've left. It's called Flame Tree Path because it's a fire access. There we go, just something to laugh at in the future. We can also integrate with cycling. So good example where some filters on side road connect directly into cycle tracks. It gives a time advantage to cycling. It's a transition. So we're going from cycle tracks on a busy road, we're turning off into a side street, which is nice and quiet. So from somebody cycling themselves, they're dropping from maybe a faster cycle track situation to a slower, quieter side street. The big problem with trying to use filters exclusively for cycling is you never tackle the main roads. You can go a long way in back streets, but not always where people need to go. And trying to do stuff on a big area wide basis does take time to develop. And again, the political horizon, really, if you've got an election, you want this stuff being done in the first and second year. The third year is when it beds in, and the fourth year maybe is when they've forgotten about it. Don't do this just before an election because politicians will get nervous. Sometimes we have opportunities. So another Waltham Forest Claxon here at West Avenue, basically weak rail bridge, can't be improved or dealt with. So it's been closed off to motors, thus increasing the lifespan of the bridge itself now. Fantastic little filter there. Get some interesting outcomes. There's a couple of these in this part of Waltham Forest. So they're almost like little pocket parks and play areas. You can just see on the right hand side, there's some low timber posts there with numbers on. Kids can jump on those and use them as stepping stones. So yeah, great little ideas. But the negative part of that is you have to have the opportunity to deal with it in the first place. We're nearly there, folks. Oh, did I duplicate that? I duplicated that one. So another Waltham Forest Claxon here. This is Francis Road, which is brilliant. It's completely transformed this area, completely transformed the shopping space. B Road, so it did have a lot of traffic through it. It's great. Comprehensive scheme. It's really effective. There's your canary species there in the road, quite happy on scooter. But it's very expensive. It takes a lot of time for delivery. And again, we're back to political capital. Last slide is some, I guess, challenges and opportunities of using filters. So I guess that prompts questions here. So the big challenge for me, I think, is in the top left. You're trying to go against this status quo, which is both legally and culturally ingrained, with issues around equity and fairness, and also inclusivity and accessibility. There's always a request for an evidence base. I mean, we go and build all sorts of crazy motor schemes and junctions and things with very little evidence on whether they've worked or not. Future weakening of projects is a massive issue, because if different politicians get in and it's very easy to remove, that could really just destroy something that's been worked on for years. So we need to be careful about how that's framed. Always need the money, and the other expenditure is that political capital. But on the positive side, people want quieter streets. It's a good way of dealing with sustainable safety in separating heavy traffic from people. Can give people better transport independence. We are getting more and more evidence as we go along. It brings people together. Sometimes not very well to start with, but people soon to grow to like these. We can offset costs. So if we are taking heavy traffic out of side streets, there's a maintenance win there straight off. And we could even put in rain gardens and other things, which long term is a reduced burden for maintenance. And as we keep finding out, possibly circumstantial in some places, they tend to be election winning, or at least election reinforcing. And that's me on this one.
Thanks, Mark. That was great. And I'm sure there'll be questions. I've got one for you to start with. And were you talking about the kind of backlash and officer time and dealing with that? And I guess while we talk a lot about engagement and consultation as being important to build support, but that's not something that's ever really kind of properly factored in or discussed. And for those authorities who've done these things before, then they kind of know that's coming down the line. But I mean, I know that here in Newcastle, you know, the amount of officer time dealing with modal filters is just like massive.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much that's really kind of factored in. Is that something that people are starting to think about and talk about a bit more, how to deal with that kind of practically?
Yeah, I don't want to steal their thunder, but University of Westminster are doing an England-wide study, mainly around the ATF2 programme that was put in during COVID. And I've been on some of the meetings of that, and these sort of things do come up. So they are being talked about in the round across England, and that knowledge will be shared eventually. There'll be reports coming out. I mean, a project I've not been directly involved, only on the periphery, but the actual cost of staff time in dealing with this stuff is much bigger than the actual infrastructure. It's crazy, really. But yeah, expect it if these things get legs, don't they? And I think from the staff involved as well, it's tiring. I mean, sometimes you need to think about, I think, swapping staff out. Don't put the engineers in front of people for those kind of things. Get communications experts on board for those projects. You need people that know how to deal with people, and engineers aren't always good at doing that.
Yeah, but it is all that time spent dealing with FOIs. And I mean, I guess, is there something around at what point does somebody become a persistent complainant? Because, you know. Yeah,
local authorities have their own process. I mean, the one thing you can do is, I would say, early stage, try and game it. What's going to come up? Get your Q&As ready and set up. And really, the more information you can get out at the start, if you get an FOI and you can just say, it's there on their website, go and look at it. So you can try and automate some of that to a certain extent, but you will end up with a few people who you'll get to know very well. There'll be some people that either they know the process or they'll learn it quickly, and they will become an absolute thorn in your side. With those, really, the way to deal with them is to say, probably not go the experimental route if you're going to get that lot of backlash. Just go ahead and do it, make a decision.
Yeah. We've got a few questions in the chat. Please put your hand up though if anybody wants to ask a question. First one is, as cars started to replace horses in cities, was there a culture war then, and can we learn from it?
Well, we always want faster horses, don't we? That's the lesson. there was a culture wars, I understand, between horses and cars at the time.
No doubt. And then we've got, given recent announcements that there's no LTN funding for current tranche in England, do you think councils outside London will be able to deliver filtering?
Don't call them LTNs. There are schemes going in all over the place. They're just not being called LTNs now. Be creative.
I mean, I don't know how many have been, certainly the ones, I don't know how many are actually funded by Active Travel England anyway. I think a lot of them aren't, is my understanding. So
yeah, there's definitely stuff going in even under the ATF4 round. There's stuff in people's pipelines and stuff that's being funded, which is traffic management.
And then another question, why do you say that car-based status quo is legally, I don't know who's asked that question because I'm not sure I can read it out.
No, I think I'll get the gist on that. So the way things have evolved from a legal point of view is like parking. Essentially, if you're driving, you can drive where you like, as fast as you like. You can make any turn you like, unless there's otherwise a national rule. So we have to drive on the left. Or if somebody brings in a local traffic order that puts a speed limit in, or a band turn, or a full filter or something. So that's where we've got to since, well, probably since the 60s or before that, with highway law and traffic law. So we've automatically got this thing that we've got this network of roads everyone can drive on. If we want to change that status quo, that's where you get the pushback immediately, because you're taking that right away from the drivers that they've had in law for not explicitly in law. It's just that law hasn't said you can't do that. And that, of course, over 100 years of motorisation is just so ingrained in the culture, or some people's culture. It's really hard to undo it.
Yeah, and then I've got another one here. How long will a 1970s pedestrian subway be expected to last physically?
God, that's a good question, isn't it? They don't age like fine wine. So eventually, structurally, they'll deteriorate. I mean, strictly speaking, any new structure should have 120-year design life if we go to the Book of Structures. And it'll probably go even further than that if you maintain it properly. But lots of 70s tunnels and bridges were not built very, very well, and they're showing signs of failure. So, yeah, your guess is as good as the structural engineers report.
Thank you. And have we got any more questions? Can't see any more in the chat. No. Right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mark. And Daniel, that was a really great session. Just another reminder that next week we are not here on Tuesday. We are going to be live from Active County in Oxford.